Testing, testing. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, great.
So here's your remote pointer. This will go, well, it must be a big picture. This will go forward, backward,
Okay.
once it catches up. And then you have a laser pointer if you'd like it with the top thing.
Great.
Okay,
Okay.
get your mute taken off.
Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Hello?
I think we're
Okay.
We're
We're
okay?
good?
So now let me just take it and we'll unmute the screen.
great.
Except we got to go backwards one slide.
No, that's good. We can step
got
down.
it.
So
Okay.
forward, okay.
Yeah.
Pointer.
Pretty straightforward.
All right.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you to John and Mark for the introduction and the invitation to come to Syracuse and teach. We're really having a lot of fun. Number one, we're really enjoying the studio and the opportunity to be here. It's particularly special for me because I'm seeing some familiar faces as as John mentioned, graduated from Syracuse. And additionally, having worked at Polshek under Jim Garrison, whose handiwork we now are standing in, and actually shared office space with Jim, growing a series of practices over the years. Tonight, what we want to talk about is a number of things. We're going to show quite a bit of our work, but also implicit in the title of tonight's lecture, Discrete Objects in Sudden Beauty, a kind of description of how we see ourselves as a young sort of emerging practice, and hopefully the content and indications of that title will be seen in some of the work that we'll explain a little bit later this evening. Just to begin, both my partner and I, Sam, are going to share the podium and speak about the work. But just to give you a little bit more background, I think John gave a really good and important, John Yoder, important introduction to the lecture series as sort of 1-hour episodes of accelerated education. And really believe that our everyday experience in our office is just that, except it's 9 hours or 10 hours of education every day. And one of the things that we really stress both in our practice and even in our studio is this idea of the network thinker. We have been, I would say, somewhat successful in our ability to expand the notion of an architectural practice by having lots of friends and associates. And those friends and associates become a very important and strategic network in accounting for what it is we do and how we will go about doing it. So engineers, artists, product specialists, right through the gamut are really important to our work and how we conceive of the work in the projects. This is a little sort of map here. This image on your left is borrowed from a book that many of you might be familiar with called The Tipping Point. There's three very important individuals in regards to the content of this book, the connector, the maven, and the salesman. And this has a distinct relationship to our office organization, which is continuing to grow. But quite frankly, we find ourselves being all of these. We are really in existence because we're able to connect to both clients. We act as the maven by connecting clients in some instances to funding, and a salesman in regards to making sure that these projects have legs. And one of the things that I think my partner will clearly illustrate is that our perhaps most important interest is that of actually seeing the work that we produce built. So in the vein of trying to achieve that goal, this sort of short matrix just describes two streams of consciousness of the office, if you will. One is clearly about practice, the other is about production and research, and clearly teaching is down here in that area of research. As far as practice goes, the part where we play connector and maven is connecting all of these people, engineers, softwares, sort of redescribing the office model, which really is to not have a model. We are sort of ebbing and flowing as the individual projects demand. I think we can actually explain that through some of the projects. Towards the end here, some of the projects will clearly be illustrated as political projects. Often architecture is talked about as far as its aesthetic qualities, its spatial qualities, but we find that more than a fair share of our projects are tied to some political notion. The lower half of this chart, which combines to the upper half, has to do with how we go about producing the work, and we clearly are heavily invested in technique and applications, which have to do with the software, obviously, really trying to retool the notion of how we, as a young office, perform, utilizing building information modeling, a new sense of construction administration, international sourcing, finding materials to build projects with, all the while sort of coming to an end here of combining some of the ultimate goals of where we stand as environmentalists, buildings that are responsive to their environments, to their programs, and to their clients. So here's there's a lot of information on this chart, so bear with me, but we think it's quite interesting. Just to give you an idea, we run these sort of project modeling tests in the office just to see how we're doing as an office, and it's pretty important, we think, so that we can calibrate where the energy is going in the office. And so this top diagram on the left here is charting creativity. The lower bar is consistent through all the graphs, and it's basically time. And I can read my own screen. Excuse me for a minute. These would actually help. I often forget about these. Yeah, great. So, and yes, and so budget here at the far left for the top diagram. And you'll see that in reality, sometimes the budget has very little to do with the amount of creativity that we're able to draw out of our own process in working on some of these projects. And in some regard, the opposite happens with regard to, here we have, gosh, I can't read that. Profit, yes, which is an important motto. No wonder it was sort of hiding. The profit often hides, right? But profit in relationship to creativity is really just our position as practicing architects to kind of keep track of where these projects are in the realm of our own goals and desires as architects, and to really sort of keep track of that. And interestingly enough, you'll see the kind of almost over-dramatized differences between the amount of creativity as it relates to budget and what happens when you start looking at the profit. There is no correlation, in fact. A lot of that may have to do with our own inefficiency as being designers, trying to get things right, retooling, remodeling, going through the projects often. And lastly, at the bottom here, it's visibility, again, in relationship to time and profit. Which matter of these projects are in the public eye versus those that are allowing us to kind of become better at our own craft and develop the skills that allow us to continue to flourish. So a number of the projects that we're going to go through this evening have themes associated with them. A couple of celebrity chef restaurants that was already described. A performance space in Brooklyn, and then and all of these are built projects or under construction, and then two rather larger scale projects, which is interesting for us to present, because I think during the reception and dinner we'd like to have some longer conversations about these. But they're again, the titles give you some indication about how we see these projects in relationship to our practice and the development that the projects go through. So they're all sort of intertwined. We're not going to sort of get into the profit time comparison just yet, but clearly I think through the descriptions of the projects you'll see how we've sort of worked as a practice closely with the clients within limited budgets, market demands, market demands, as well as sure it'll go away. No, it won't. I might need some assistance here, but in any case, I'm going to turn the talk over to my partner, Sam, who's going to describe a number of projects to you.
So I'm going to start off with Cheryl's. Cheryl's was a design for a new restaurant for a chef, and she was a Food Network personality. Prior to this, we had actually completed a few restaurants. A little louder. Can you hear me? Is this better? Is that better? Okay, sorry. So prior to this, we had actually completed a few projects, restaurant projects. So we were familiar with the intricacies of program, but we also recognized that there were many other issues involved with restaurants, including the New York high rents, the marketability, the economics, the premium that is actually placed on design itself, because of the large competition that happens in New York. So this balancing act that happens between investment and potential market that we actually have to account for, and we actually find interesting to sort of understand the underlying market. So oftentimes restaurants have, or because of the competition, create this sort of theatrical experience. They are manufactured from a sort of saturation of materials. You can see here a very extreme example, which is the Russian tea room in New York. And through furnishings and through wall coverings to produce the overall experience. So when we were given a 30-seat restaurant and a limited budget, we were thinking about, well, could we actually achieve experience? Could we manage a budget? Could we start to look at this as a single surface that could actually as well give a very highly visual impact? So the client's always a determinant with every project. And alongside, she's a New Yorker, and she's also has some Caribbean ties. So we actually started talking about the experience of the restaurant being both relaxed and comfortable. And as well, we sort of looked at some of the early images that she had in mind, such as parasols and so forth. But back to, again, the single surface, we looked at the single surface not only for just the form and shape itself, but also the sort of background information, the structure and the efficiency that is behind the actual surface, how the material actually gets formed to that structure, how it gets retooled, how it gets fastened on, how the material itself starts to pucker. So, so when we were, again, here's a hull of a ship, we were actually concerned much more with the efficiency of the actual structure. So when we were thinking about the material and structure, we literally came across pallet, and there was a conversation that we had the other day that this was material, and Shawn reminded me that was just along the street where we happened to have our office in New York, and it was just apparently there. It was lining the building, and it was a material that on one hand, it has this authenticity of being related to New York, because oftentimes architects are sitting at the computer and we're sourcing material and we're calling on samples and looking at the finishes, but there was something about actually using a material that was local, that actually represented where this restaurant was supposed to be, and as well as the obvious sort of sustainable issues and the environmental concerns as well. But what was more interesting to us with using the palette was actually taking apart the material. Taking apart the material, refashioning it, retooling it, and how that actually gets shaped and ultimately patterned. So with any kind of single surface, we also set up a problem for ourselves. As the complexity grew, we kind of had to understand what the actual pattern surface were ultimately going to be, and also the efficiency of the structure that was going to hold it. So here is an image of the restaurant looking back towards the rear. the ceiling itself starts to fold down as the kitchen door. It also screens the service area. It also turns into the backrest of the seating. So in a way, it starts to orchestrate the program and also gives a sort of defining quality of the restaurant itself. And here, looking towards the front. And back to some of the desires of the client, she had talked about sort of a beach experience. So this was almost like an idea of sitting under a parasol. And you can actually start to get a sense of how the palettes get retooled against that background of New York City there. Again, how the surface starts to fold down. And here the actual facade doors start to pocket into the surface itself. And it was actually beyond the sort of detailing mechanism and trying to solve that mechanism, but it was ultimately for the effect that the surface could actually start to extend to the outside and start to delineate the outside and the inside. And then ultimately for surface, together with the lighting, with the material, that it starts to give some quality and overall image and high impact for the restaurant. So Gannett was a subsequent project, and this time it was an Ethiopian restaurant. So with the Ethiopian restaurant, you immediately have sort of image, you have this association to ancient structures, as well as to the carvings and shadows. We also looked at the strong symbols of the Ethiopian crosses. They're very distinctive with a sort of woven design and patterns. And it's perhaps the country's strongest symbol. And it's not only religious, but it also extends to the culture and social life as well. So we started researching the pattern of the crosses, the Ethiopian crosses, as well as looked at the traditional Ethiopian textiles. And just another aside, it's like many other contemporary practices, we're interested in the tiling and the tessellation and the pattern, but what was actually much more important in this project was actually understanding that this was a cultural, there was cultural relevance to it. The client, she's very much a storyteller. She's very proud of her heritage. And it was important for us, and actually a challenge for us, to start to embed some of these qualities within the development of the surface itself. So here's a series of iterations of the Ethiopian crosses. We looked at tiling them. We looked at simplifying, because there's always an issue of fabrication in the end. So again, we were thinking about what was the appropriate scale for this geometry, given sort of what we wanted to achieve. So here, the screen actually during the day, and how the effect that it actually acts as a screen against the light, and it's almost like this dappled light feel as you kind of sit. That's the actual seating behind and the table in front. This is the 4x8 panel configuration. The patterns were actually scaled and provided to the builder for laser cutting into this sheet metal. The actual panels were laid out. They were sized, and the patterns was actually located strategically on each of the panels, because ultimately when they were to tile together, you can actually see each of these panels, that the pattern would just seamlessly extend across the whole surface itself. Just back to just one note about this drawing as well. Sorry. Here it was dimensioned, and the material only being sheet metal, we actually folded and creased the material so that it would actually develop its strength, so that it could actually be freestanding. Here you see it folded and create seating coves. image of the restaurant. The surface ultimately organized to create a traditional dining configuration that is very familiar in an Ethiopian setting. Oh, I lost the screen. Oh, sorry. And as well, when we were looking at the surface development, we had researched Ethiopian tent structures, and it was lit in such a way that it also extended the actual idea of a pitched tent structure. So here again, just the effect that you would actually see where the material and the material development, the surface technique actually embedded what we felt was actually very relevant in terms of a cultural representation and the overall atmosphere and effect. So De Gras is actually not a restaurant. It's actually currently under construction right now. It is located in Brooklyn in the Gowanus, and it happens to be a light manufacturing zone. It is a renovation to an existing warehouse, and it was to house music. It is to house music, dance, film. It is a venue that they had ideas about introducing exterior space or something where you can actually get a reprieve from the grittiness of the neighborhood. So the clients in this project were a couple. They were very serious in terms of they were connoisseurs of live music. So the agenda was absolutely clear that this performance space, this venue would actually resonate with music lovers. It would perform to the demands of good acoustics, and the performance would, or the design of the performance would actually be based on the criteria of the acoustics. So we first had an idea, and on the bottom you can actually see just the warehouse, that we would introduce a kind of surface or liner to organize the program, and topping it off with some kind of green space that would, again, a cut in the roof would introduce both light and air into the space. We weren't really quite sure what the surface or the shape of the liner would be, but ultimately that it would be a surface manipulated design process that would take into account the acoustic development. So early on, we had worked with an engineer, and we kind of got our lessons on reverb and reverberation time. The top graph actually looks at untreated space versus a treated space where the frequency starts to get lower, and that is due to both the shape and shaping of the walls, or the ceiling and the actual vertical surfaces and the horizontal surfaces, as well as to the treatment of the surface itself, meaning the material development. So again, with some of the inherent problems with industrial spaces or warehouse spaces, that the parallel walls actually produce a sort of echo effect that we couldn't have happen in the venue for live music. The bottom graph was sort of the optimum levels for reverberation, and again, what was actually going to be absorbed in the wall surface itself, and what was going to be reflected. So when we were also thinking about the material, there was also an idea that the surface would be incorporated with some kind of sound, and that the surface, the material, would have some kind of performance. Now, being in the Gowanus, there is still almost industrial waste that you find lying around, and it was intriguing for us to start to think again, how can we start to address both the context of the site using a local material as well as a material that actually would perform. So the wall started shaping, and this is a drawing of both the top and bottom chord. the walls were actually canted in both directions, meaning X, Y, and Z. So we had to actually give the builder, who actually turned out, the client became the builder. So it was a solution that provided him with an easy way of building, so there was no question to the sort of complexity of the construction itself. So the drawings actually developed for him alongside with the plans were axonometric, so he could actually get an instant visual. So here are the walls under construction. And they are shaped and canted and angled towards the actual performance spaces. Ultimately, the surface or the plywood is going to be embedded with speakers, and then it's going to be laminated with recycled rubber made from recycled tires. So again, when we were thinking about how to rework the ceiling, we had the flat ceiling that you could see in this photo. We actually took a page from reverb or reverberation testing rooms, and it's the idea of like what was reflected, how much was absorbed, and the diffuse of the actual sound to scatter in a lot of directions, so you can kind of get an overall ambiance. So we started looking at patterns, and the first image, the image of the fish, you instantly get this notion of pattern, but it was actually much more than the pattern that we were after, but it was also the behavior of interruptions that we had to deal with, because inherently with any kind of renovations, you always have to work around certain existing conditions or even program association. So these are just early models of the ceiling itself, and they were going to be comprised of individual pieces of recycled felt. Some of these models are very helpful in terms of understanding the logic of the construction and the structure. You actually see the lines on the models, starting to look at the underlying pattern that is happening as we sort of maneuver between some of the existing conditions. This model, you can start to see how the surface would be inflected. This was actually over the stage performance area, and that the surface itself and how it would double curve and the curvature would actually start to project sound as well as absorb and reflect as required. And so here another model showing the double curvature. And then ultimately, this is just a screenshot from 3D Max. A lot of times in the development stage, we're looking at rapidly developing the design, but it's also a tool that during construction, we can control parametrically how we're going to deal with some of the found conditions within the actual construction site. Here is the ceiling as its most current state. So the actual lines of structure, it's been sort of a long process and development and under construction at its current state. So you kind of get the courtyard. These are the conditions that we're starting to have to kind of work around. So it's this sort of evolving notion, and it's been a process between understanding the program to the surface manipulation, back to the structure, and then back again.
Okay. So just to continue along, we did mention early on that the nature of the work itself is, we still believe that there's a connection between this title that we proposed for the lecture, and I think in the previous series there was an intimacy of scale that allowed one to see how these discrete objects, whether they were crosses from Ethiopia and or in this case the performance criteria and specific information regarding sound levels that became discrete objects, speakers, the instruments of the musicians themselves, that became part of the dictation of how we would actually manage these sites and renovations. In this next series of projects, the scale is a bit bigger, and in some instances gets quite large. And there's another additional lesson to be learned here. This first project, North Carolina, is about economy of scale, and I do mean economy. This was a very tight budget. Was one of the first projects that first ground-up projects that we completed. And it's very sort of close to my heart because of the fact that it probably came this close to never getting built. And so there's a certain matter of perseverance that I can talk about, but we won't. We'll touch on it. Excuse me. So this is a recent publication by Susanna Serafman by Monticelli Press, the title Modern Shoestring. Interestingly enough, Susanna came to us and asked if we had a house that fit a very specific criteria, and that criteria was a pretty paltry budget. And in fact, I know that the school and Mark is embarking on a house competition that is really trying to speak about the notion of architectural design, not at a premium, but at an accessible sort of economy of scale and price. And this is one of those projects. This quick diagram essentially just represents a typical process. Generally, there's an individual or individuals that have resources and they go shopping for a house, so they go that way. Or if they're perhaps more adventurous, they would seek a contractor and buy one of the contractor's house and or build their house. In some ways, a kind of typical process. This, what we're calling a sort of rogue process, because it was pretty much difficult and challenging, to say the least. For one, we started with the design of the house without necessarily knowing a budget. And you'll find that many clients ask for square footage, but they are sort of not revealing how much resources they have to match that square footage. So it's somewhat backwards, if you will. So we met all their criteria with regards to the square footage, even got into the materiality of which they were interested in, as most clients are. And then we finally arrived at the resources which simply did not match either the materials and or the design. They fell way short. And interestingly enough, I think many architects have a very similar story about engaging a number of contractors, all of which say we can build this house at outrageous prices, and that leads to the client taking over the responsibilities of being the contractor. And then if all goes well, you arrive at a house, in this case, 4 years later. So we did fire a number of contractors. The early diagram that we mentioned regarding the office organization, where we really sort of now getting into really sourcing materials as the project moves along to make sure that, one, we're achieving the design goals that we have, but also making sure that the project's fiscally responsible and we can get it built. So this project was a really important lesson we learned. The cedar siding for this project came from Canada, of all places. And the project itself is located in North Carolina. Turns out that North Carolina exports more cedar and wood out of the state than it actually uses in its own construction industry. So there's some odd things going on when you find out the cycle of goods that are out there. With regard to the resources again, I'm going to show you some plans, but I remember being in Syracuse and finding out that one of Giuseppe Turani's buildings were drawn in one fashion and then built in another. And sure enough, this is something that we had to do. This is some of the early studies of how the spatial organization would work, a skin that would actually wrap, private skin that would actually wrap part of the project, turning those spaces into more private spaces with the remainder being public. We showed these to the clients because of their previous histories being New York City residents, used to window shopping, used to growing up and living in high-rise apartment buildings as high as the 15th floor with terraces, and so there was a certain comfort and expectation that they had with regards to their living habits. This plan, as I was beginning to mention, had on numerous occasions a number of walls that were somewhat fictitious to turn each one of these structural grid lines into defined rooms. The reason being because the lender, which was our resource arm, only knew how to value houses based on the number of rooms in comparison to the square footage. So they can sell your house if it has 6 bedrooms, but if it has sort of open floor plan, there's a bit of confusion about how to value the house. And so finally, out of frustration, we literally produced a mock set of plans and gave them to the bank, assuming that, well, we can remove the walls because we ran out of money, but yet we used the available lending that they provided us. So we were able to actually get the house funded and built along those lines because it was atypical. This is in Charlotte, North Carolina. 99% of the homes are actually contractor built, so a young architect arrives on the scene, I think we were actually called Slick New York Architects at the time. The engineer was from California, so we had some cantilevers. They were really having a good time sort of joking about our disposition. But in general, the plan is pretty straightforward. The entry here, reflecting pool, outdoor space, very open ground floor, guest bedroom down below. The upper floor, which is again all of the private areas with the 2-story gallery space, more bedrooms. The features that became intrinsic to the design because of the client's previous life in New York were in fact these terraces. They really liked being outdoors, and so in fact we thought what better way to have terraces up amongst the trees, not quite the 15th floor, but there is some relationship there. So here's a number of pictures that taken directly from the Monticelli Press book, which we have to thank them for, clearly showing that there's this relationship between interior and exterior. I would actually say that more than 50% of the materials were imported into the state for the project. This was specially treated cement fiber panels that became an interior liner. The cedar board was actually shipped in from Canada, as I already mentioned. The rest primarily stucco work. But those two materials themselves, not being able to find competitive pricing, we actually sourced right there outside of the state. Here's a image of the other bone of contention regarding the construction of this project, which was this cantilevered family room that required us to actually sit in front of a mock board of about 5 individuals from the building department in Charlotte, North Carolina, and explain to them, actually Mecklenburg County, so this was just outside of the city, a small county, and explain to them and get them to sign off that this house was actually structurally sound with this little pier wall holding this. Contractors used to come by and say, what is this thing, a school? What is it, a medical center? Quite a few things. Just really not quite used to it. I must sort of thank another supplier. The windows for this project were originally bid at over $100,000. We were frankly told that any home with a percentage over 50 of exterior glazing is going to run beyond that amount of money. We said that, well, if that's the case, then we don't have a project. Sure enough, we did our own sourcing. This is unfamiliarity again, so the importance of knowing your materials and expectations of those materials went directly to a number of commercial window manufacturers. This is nothing but 8-foot window sliders, commercial storefront. I think we were able to do the entire house by retrofitting the design for about $30,000, $40,000 for all the windows. Low-E glass, insulated, fine. The client himself, who was that little picture of, is extremely proud of this fact and is consistently telling his buddies that he has Windows Series S500 from, he can go on for days. The living spaces and their relationships to the exterior, it's quite beautiful setting, 5 acres of land set into the lot. This is a kind of nice summer day. There's the interior 2-story space. The galley down toward the sliding glass panels, the cantilever, and just the evening shot. You can get a sense of some of the spaces of those terraces in the box. So again, learning that lesson from this economy of scale and trying to arrive at a working methodology from beginning to end, we're now embarked on schematic design, or actually DD, in fact, for a 14-story residential tower in Brooklyn. Pretty large square footage. The client are a father and son team who own quite a number of properties throughout New York, in the process of developing one that's under construction in the Columbia University area on the island of Manhattan. And they have this series of lots in Brooklyn, which they combine to be able to build a residential tower. Now, I'm sure everyone's completely aware of the housing and lending mortgage crisis that we are now engaged in. We've had colleagues of ours, very good friends, other architects, who like to tease us and say, well, you know your 14-story tower is dead. The economy is just not going to be able to support it. And we had been feeling this way from the start. We felt that our client was a little late getting into the game, but pretty young and I'll even say a little bit reckless, so we're sort of moving along. And in fact, recently had the plans approved by the Department of Buildings in New York. So this project is really about managing all of the parameters, including those that would either allow or deny a project's life. So here's the outline of the site. It's very close to Manhattan, so it's desirable land in relationship to its proximity. So we'll probably fit very well into the mid-market range. Our notion about this design in wanting to see it built is how can we actually produce a design that can actually manage the market. So some pretty early research just to kind of make sure that our client as well as ourselves understood what it was that we were embarking on. So New York is full of residential towers. There's a fantastic article in the New York Times touting the new glass tower and the lifestyles that are now being associated with it. There's often talk of the cost to move into one of these. So trying to figure out where we were in this relationship. So Tribeca, New York, average construction cost, $800 a square foot. Lower East Side, $480 a square foot. We're talking some pretty high numbers here. $400 a square foot for Park Slope, Brooklyn, which is one of the most desirable areas in the borough of Brooklyn. Williamsburg, where our studio site is, about 300, and we're scaling down. Clinton Hill, 266. Lexington, the area where our development is at 240. Why did we do this? We needed to essentially prove that in the scale of things, economy of scale, that this project was actually worth doing because it fit well into the parameters of how much a developer would spend. Is this traditional architectural work? Some may argue yes, some may argue no. But if you want to see your projects built and you're a young office, sometimes you need to prove that your client's idea is in fact a good idea. And so that's what this was about. So here we are in the middle of the scale. Now we need to come up with this interesting FAR strategies. And Sam and I have always found it interesting that MVRDV, the Dutch firm, Farmax, great publication, a firm outside of the context of New York where FAR is everything, floor area ratio, how much you can build, had sort of diagnosed the importance of this idea and really let it play out in the development of its architecture. I think we had known this and had been waiting for a project to kind of explore the same tendencies. So we went through a series of exercises that were sort of demanded by the client. What's my tower going to look like? Our tower is on a 4-story base. The base building is yet to be determined, which is, again, because of the market. They're trying to get a bank in there. They've tried schools. They've tried community centers. So as opposed to us designing each one of those, we have to wait for the market to tell us which one they're going with and proceed from there. So there's a number of series of examinations of what the tower will become, all spatially derived, all trying to figure out what the relationship of the configuration is to that FAR. And then, interestingly enough, our client wasn't so much interested in FAR, but wanted to know where are the views at, because that's how I'm selling this thing. There's some great views of Lower Manhattan by the time you get to the 5th floor of this property. Fantastic, what I would say, premium views. And so everyone from Corcoran to Douglas Elliman, our client, knowing the market, realized that that's going to be the primary selling factor. So here we have this client who wants this 14-story tower, occasionally bemoans the fact that lending's getting tight. They are not completely flush because of their other projects. They really want to see it done. They really came to us because they thought that we could provide them with a competitive product, an interesting design, which I'm getting to. But there was this fear that they would not be able to pull this off, and we shared that fear with them, not because of the design, but because of the market. So the first slide was called Layer Cake. You might remember it. Some of you might remember the movie. And we started thinking that, well, what if you could build a building in stages, but yet the final product still had a cohesive form and was viable as an addition to a neighborhood in its incremental growth. So strategically here, we're proposing that our client could build his project in groups or quarters, if you will. And I'll show you a little bit more about that. So we went through a series of studies and iterations about maybe they can build them as vertical extruded squares, shuffled and stacked like a puzzle. There's probably countless numbers of these images that we sort of went through to figure out what's the best possible way. These are not productive in regards to the construction methodology that is readily available, so that led us to this sort of stacking, very much like the layer cake scenario. Oops. Let's see if this plays. This is an animation that we've been having some video technical difficulties, so, well, if you can imagine, these things sort of drop down out of the sky and land on this space. So in any case, there's a number of study models that are, I feel bad about that, but it's okay. Essentially, these are the 4 components of the building, these residential blocks that arrive at different times as need be according to what's available regarding the construction. And that led us to understand that we could not fetishize over the facade. We had to come up with a facade that could reliably receive a facade system that would unify the building if, in fact, it was not completed in one sort of construction city. So in looking at the site, which I'm not showing you here, you see this sort of residual courtyard back here that is actually the perfect scale for a crane, one of the large cranes that benefits the idea that, well, we can, in fact, have the stanchion set up there on consecutive sort of outings and begin to actually construct upper levels. So these are the floor plans that the apartments lay out in. We were sort of really had some long, drawn-out battles and discussions about the floor plan, in fact, because our client insisted that they needed 3 apartments along the Manhattan view side, even though those did not produce what we would imagine to be the best possible layouts. The diagram on the right, on your left, I'm sorry, here, showing the 4 volumes that would essentially potentially be staged as a way of getting the project built. Going back to this idea of sourcing the materials, our client, again, concerned about budget, accessibility of funding, now loves the idea that, okay, if we can do this in stages, let's proceed. But I don't want my building to sort of look like it's been growing without any cohesive strategy. So we went through this exercise of envisioning what, in fact, the facade being the tool to actually bring the entire structure back together, led us to connecting with a Chinese manufacturer of window systems that are compatible with some of the US products, Conair being one of them, FCO being another, and in fact, designed with a higher strength aluminum alloy, so in fact, thinner profiles, larger sections, and a much cheaper cost, customized for the building. And customized for the structural frame that would be receiving them. In addition to that, if I go back again to this slide, so we realized that to sell the project, we needed to potentially ramp up on the economy of the project and thereby use one window system for the entire facade. And see if we can't be prolific in the design as well as the kind of issue of the economy. And along with that, that left us with the residual of the rest of the surface. So again, we get on our sourcing broom and travel the world. We found a concrete manufacturer through an image in one of our journals that led us to a project in Paris. From Paris, we contacted the company to find out that once again they had a subsidiary in Canada, which we got really excited about, even though the dollar and Canadian dollar are the same. So we got excited for a short while and then realized we're not gaining anything. But then it turns out that the concrete panels that this particular company makes, the company that produces the liners is located in Long Island. So sure enough, we went from Paris to Canada, back to Long Island, and then back to our office in Manhattan, completely thrilled by this idea, and had some really long, interesting conversations with them about the possibilities of what we can do with these panels. And to alleviate our client's concern about the facade and visual interest, we indicated to him that we've just discovered a pretty affordable panel that we can create difference in, albeit all the panels are essentially the same. Right? We can come up with 3 liners, we can texture the surface, we can taper the surface, so in fact we're not ending up with a flat building surface, but as the next image shows, the surface of the tower in fact is sort of fractured, and so the casting of shadows, and we were concerned that any building with one material, one window system might be rather difficult to embrace. And so are there ways through the fabrication of the materials that we can figure out ways to actually deconstruct the surface at a number of levels and get more visual performance out of it? So here's our stacked frame, a number of the images of the sections as they're received. And the stacking actually helped us realize that we could actually propose that the stacking could produce its own difference in regards to the sections, so that you clearly understood what grouping you belong to or when you bought into the building. So here you're lucky you bought in early, you're $100 a square foot, or not that, but something lower. Each time the investment goes up, so we saw to the client that in fact that you could actually ride the market. You have one set of pricing here that builds the building, take that profit, build the next one, but you're going to get that profit back because conceivably the real estate values are going up. So we go on this little real estate ride. liked it so much, he says, well, I'll spend more money and we'll look at a new facade system now. And so then we started over and contacted our Chinese manufacturer again and looked at a plug-in system. Each one of these corresponds to a 20-foot wide frame, floor to ceiling, that can be lifted by crane and plugged into the facade, thus getting the unity of the facade back together again. And there is our proposal. Each one of these has some subtle differences regarding terraces. That became yet a new addition from the client, who really started seeing dollar signs all through the orchestration of how this layer cake project might actually work. And here's a detail of where we are with that. I think I might have mentioned that we just received DOB approval probably 2-3 weeks ago. So they can move forward. So this last project is a bit of a teaser for you. We have been investigating a number of things and again staying closely tied to the economies and how these clients have to respond and react to the projects in relationship to what's going on in the market. So many of you might know the context of Soho in New York, historical. It is a historical district, which means that every project in that district has to go through review. And in fact, it also means that the review process and the concern of those people in relationship to the project has nothing to do with the planning, but it has everything to do with what the building looks like. And our client, who is a foreign fashion retailer who bought the parcel of land and very much has a history and appreciation of modern architecture, almost at one of the first meetings asked Sam, so we're going to buy this lot, but we can build a modern building, can we? Sort of asked the question because they weren't quite sure. And of course we said yes, not quite sure because there aren't that many models that would support that answer, but we felt that we could perhaps find a way. We have former colleagues that have served as commissioners on the review board for Soho, and so we thought we can figure out a way to do this. This comment to me sums up the quandary that we were in. This is Donald Trump. Donald Trump just is near completion of his Soho Trump Tower, or the Trump Soho Tower, which is in Soho. And I'll just read right from the slide. There would be no architecturally forward design. That means progressive design. It would be a simple approval-friendly box, the way Trump likes it. This is the New Yorker magazine writing this portion here. And then to quote Trump, in New York, he says, in quotes again, I can build a box as of right, which means just legally within the existing regulations, or I can get creative, decide what that really means, and go through 10 years of community boards and still get refused 32-0, 32 community board members. Given that choice, I'll build a box. Now, you and I all know that there are troves of developers who admire and follow Trump's lead. And so this is the predicament that not only we find ourselves in, but I'm sure many of you will find yourselves in. So what do you do? So we thought, okay, what if we have to be rational about this. We can't have our blinders on as designers and feel that we'll propose what we propose and we'll see what happens. We have had friends with projects in Soho who have literally left the community board meetings and the presentation meetings, as the saying goes, with their tail between their legs because of how poorly it went in the presentation of the work. And so we have this puzzle. We have Soho as the context. It sort of looks like this. These beautiful cast iron buildings, some of them incredibly ornate with masonry. They are indeed gorgeous. And everyone knows so. That's why it's probably the most expensive land outside of Tribeca in New York. The clientele who lives there, we all know, Hollywood A-listers, etc. the amount of space. There generally isn't a floor-to-floor height that's less than 10 feet. At closer inspection, we begin to realize that what they are, as far as the Landmarks Commission is concerned, are cast iron decorative elements that are applied to structure. And that gave us a clue of how we could rationally propose something else. So even at a finer scale, we find that there's quite a bit of grill work at the street level that is tying in equally and nicely with the cast iron columns and application, again, to the structure. And sometimes just sitting in window frames, and they all vary in interesting, unique, and intriguing ways. But this is also Soho. This is very particular to Soho. It doesn't really exist outside of Soho, but is the norm there. As we begin to look around in the UK through historical references, we find that structure and ornamentation have been wed very closely throughout history. And here, if we look at the tangent of those curves at the fluted columns, we find that there are, in fact, arches that are being produced there. And the fluting and the ornamentation are actually playing in one-to-one with the structure. And in addition to that, we're starting to relocate and re-identify these patterns. Sam talked about patterns earlier on. These patterns are going through their own degrees of tessellation. So there's mathematics, there's art at work here that we found as an inlet, if you will, to what might be considered our own rationale for how we might go about proposing a building in Soho that is looking at new developments architecturally. So a series of tessellated geometric patterns at various scales, and one can only sort of undeniably make the association as it relates to previous histories of architecture. So quickly, to kind of amass where we were in our own aspirations, and not to speak about ornamentation, because we know what happens in the context of a place like Soho. People respond to the buildings that are there. So our goal was, what if we really began to wed sort of crossbreed ornamentation and structure to the degree that we can make this argument to the Soho and the Landmarks Commission that, in fact, we're doing nothing but what the existing context is already doing, except we're actually wedding them even at a much closer and tighter range. So, and to tie that to some sort of structural proficiency as well, not just for the sake of the ornamentation, but so the weight of floor slabs, corresponding loads, the structure's own weight, transferred to a base, a foundation, via a succession of diagonal members, which is diagrid for those who sort of know where some of this might be going. The concentration of rigid internal grid sections are located where they are most efficient and correspond to visibility and heat gain concerns. So New York City, Soho, some of the highest wealth in the city, as well as a kind of intellectual base. They are talking about performative buildings, and so we started to speak along the same lines. How will this building perform in terms of sunlight, visibility, heat gain? Typical floor plan, again, I mentioned that the client understands that they're just looking for square footage. It's open office floor plates in a retail store over 5, perhaps 6 floors, depending on how the FAR pans out. The site itself is 20 by 70 approximately, with a sheared rear yard. So going back to some of those images, we started just doing our own kind of basic research. There's, again, a plentiful series of these drawings that basically embed a familiar diagrid into a smaller pattern, and we begin to tessellate those patterns at smaller scales to see, in fact, if we can still rely on the structural integrity by working with the engineers and provide a framework that allows the facade and structure and ornamentation to basically crossbreed, if you will. So here is one of the exercises. Again, we started very much with traditional diagrid structures that are becoming even more prolific these days. And through an ever-increasing series of tessellated patterns and working with the engineers, figuring out which degree of tessellation is still actually operating successfully as structure and which part of that is actually starting to go over toward the side of ornamentation. But what we're talking about here is really making a proposal to the Landmarks Commission and our client who's behind this, to Soho, saying that really what we're doing is no different than the buildings that exist here. In fact, we're trying to take this one step further. This is probably an animation because of our, oh, look, it's working. Unbelievable. Surprise. So this, for our own purposes, again, this is in schematic design still. This is all in-house stuff that we're currently working on diligently. We feel really fortunate to have this project in the office and really want to make a legitimized statement about how we can actually embrace structure and ornamentation in a way that makes sense in a contemporary standpoint. It's very hard to argue to pay for ornamentation on a building when in fact through value engineering it's the first thing that goes away. And so again, we're trying to make sure that they all are embedded in the project so that we don't lose them. So here's a kind of quick render of our project in its context. It's crude. We're still sort of working on this. And in fact, we've had numerous discussions about the reception, if you will, of that as a neighbor and what it's doing in relationship to structure and ornamentation in regards to how this tries to communicate the same values, same methodology, and even make it more efficient and again crossbreed those issues into one single structure. Clearly as well, the depth of that structure is changing as it's going up. Likewise, you see that the columns up here, well, not in this building, but generally a lot of the buildings in Soho have an ascending or descending scale in relationship to the decorative components that are truly not even performing structurally, but are pretending to. So here we have smaller degrees of tessellation that are related to, in some instances, where the core is, but also to where there might be structural differentiation in regards to the required load. So if we go back for, whoops, I don't know what I just did. Just for a moment, clearly at critical junctures, at floor lines, and at these nodes where the structure comes together, we had to quickly amass a strategy about how these things would be supporting floor slabs because we know just through the research that exoskeletons and floor slab connections are extremely difficult and costly. So what if you use something that didn't require such precise loading and closure? We started looking at those nodes that you were seeing where the pattern actually overlaps and crosses and begins to tessellate. We'll take this one as an example. This is a reinforced composite material, and when you think about concrete material, it's the same thing that is actually designed as a seat, if you will. So this component here begins to organize itself as a receptacle for the male component that would actually fit into that slot and support the edge of the floor slab along that structural grid. Right? And then a shear diagram showing how those things work in the plane. So that related to instances that associate themselves like that. And so to sort of conclude, I guess going back again to the initial description of this whole talk, right? These kind of discrete objects, which I would actually call these things, the components and detailing that has to do with buildings, finding a way to actually populate those materials in a fashion, as well as the kind of agenda of the design to hopefully see it built one day, so that through that proliferation, we might arrive at what some might argue to be beautiful products. And beautiful not in the sense of their aesthetic quality, but hopefully in their performance quality, in their economic fiscal responsibility, as well as their perhaps aesthetic qualities. So, thank you very much.
We have just a couple minutes for questions. If you have questions.
Your proposal. Are you hoping to overcome, sort of get it through the committee, let's see, taking the rational similarities between the two types of structures to overcome aesthetic dissimilarities?
Yes. Yes, because in fact, the Landmarks Commission, as I prefaced, their principal concern is the visual characteristics of new projects in Soho. So from that standpoint, to overcome just that one hurdle, but then there's our own hurdles that I think we had to come to terms with, whether or not we were working intelligently or whether we found ourselves for a brief moment working as decorators. Right? We can decorate this facade, but that's generally not what we like to do. And if we do tout this idea of proficiency, responsibility, you are trying to boil down, if you will, all of the components to get greater durability and life out of them. So knowing that the aesthetic concerns are there, what type of work allows those aesthetic concerns to be embedded so they don't get washed away or trivialized? So we thought, what better examples than some of the historic imagery, taking those apart to explain our own rationale in a way that could be understood perhaps by a layperson.
Yeah, as is usually the case for me anyway, I'm still thinking about the first slide. And I think it was the first slide, the diagram of your practice and the multiple, a kind of flow chart that suggests different kinds of intelligence as being tapped or interconnected, and any one project would bring out a different set of relationships in that diagram. But I was also interested in how that diagram then allows you to interconnect with consultants or other kind of specialists, and the degree to which in any of these projects I found myself wondering, who did you work with, or how did you find that out, or to what degree is that matrix rich enough internally that you're able to make these discoveries, simply because of the experience of the people in the office, or your own.
It's gone through evolution. I don't think we can absolutely say that we already have a database of expertise of who we want to work with. I think a point being that we are looking at factors not inherently in architectural practice. There's usual expertise of structural engineering, mechanical engineers, and so forth. But we're also looking at, talking and being open to other factors like the business financial, to even being open to other influences. So I think it's been sort of an evolution of what we look at, and we don't actually exclude any kind of factors. And I think that it grows and it changes depending on what we work on and what we actually try to see that is important in each of the projects. So besides the actual engineering of, say Soho, where we'll, start to talk to engineers and different. We're also looking at other industries for the material, and we're not only sourcing within the architectural limitations of database, basically. So a lot of it is, thank God for the computer, I have to say.
Well, I mean, Mark's question is a really good one too, because our introduction to, I mean, some of the reason why we feel confident to even move forward with something like this last project, for instance, is because 2004, we were shortlisted for a project in Miami, museum project. And we were clearly the youngest firm, the smallest firm. And, we felt really fortunate out of the group of 50 or so who responded to this project to get selected to the final 3. And we realized, we said, we know that this is a handicap in this culture. So what we did through working on some other projects, we had a relationship with Bureau Happold. And a really good friend of mine who works there as a partner, we called him up and said, we need the 100-pound gorilla in the room because we're the 10-pound baby, basically. That relationship was phenomenal. I mean, they carried us, quite frankly, through that project and opened up a series of considerations that normally I think architects rely on those engineers to handle. And so all of a sudden we were describing our project to this committee in Miami, surely talking about the design, but then we were talking about the environmental factors, we were talking about the cost of building it on this beachfront property. It was actually in Miami on Biscayne Bay, which required this enormous investment into the foundations that we found out later other firms hadn't really talked about. And so it gave us a level of credibility and expertise that the other firms were not coming to the table with. It was so well received so early in the career that we just said, we're going to keep doing this and repeating ourselves to the point where we will talk about design. We don't shy away from it, but the design is predicated on another series of issues that we feel are important to one's investment.
Hi. This is a question regarding our project currently right now and the development of a component and surface manipulation. And I was wondering if you two could just talk about how you manipulate your surfaces and how they play with the development of components and like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, in regards to how you continue to develop each one and your new reiterations as they continue.
I'll be really, I mean, it's going to sound like a short answer, but it's true. We cheat. Essentially what that means is that, depending on the gold and what's available in the project, I think DeGraw had such a rich palette to pull from regarding the acoustic demands. And our acoustic designer, Brian Dorfman, was he was ecstatic the fact that he was like, what, you want to listen to me? You want me to look at your design? Why? And so we were sort of handing it over. Like, does this work? This is what we've tried. And you get some really honest responses. Don't even bother. This doesn't work. This won't produce any values acoustically. And then he was completely honest, although it looks great. So we've had, I think, solutions that look better than the performative ones. But clearly, to maintain our position as credible and thoughtful, we would start to lean towards those ones that we feel may not be the most aesthetic from a design perspective. But again, that issue of sudden beauty, it has to do with not just what it looks like, but is it really performing? We have, Sam mentioned, the clients are insane about live music. And they introduced us to a culture in New York that we only skimmed the surface.
That we didn't know.
The number of bands, where they're coming from to play, and the number of people that descend on these venues. This is 8,000 square feet of space, which will be one of the largest ones. As an aside, the sound engineer started by saying, we'll make the space Dolby approved. Anyone know what that is? Right? So Dolby approved is all this list of criteria that your space has to meet. And if it meets that criteria, this project would have been one of 2 spaces in New York City which would essentially fill their calendar just about every possible day of the year because of that criteria. Now, to meet that criteria was extremely stringent and beyond the capacity of what their budget had available. So they gave way to it, but we still came pretty close to meeting the demands of the sound engineer, who consistently threw out ideas that we presented because, again, you cheat up to a certain level where your expertise is really not there any longer, and you have to hand it over to someone else to say, okay, proceed. Choose this one. This one is starting to work, and you refashion that. So there's consistently this process of evaluation that you have to go through and be honest in that evaluation.
But in terms of the chicken and egg, it jumps around. And like the ceiling, for instance, at DeGraw, it went through a lot of iteration. And some of it was just the existing condition, and then we were back at the drawing board. Some of it was the financing, and then we were back at the drawing board. And some of it was just the material wasn't available. And so we had to rework, rethink, and it kept on changing. So the computer is one tool that we could actually quickly redesign, because that, in a way, it's only a tool, but it helps us actually generate quite quickly very fast result, and then we can evaluate it, as Shawn was saying, but there's never direction. Sometimes it comes from the client, sometimes it comes from the expertise, and so there's always a back and forth, and sometimes we're jumping back and we can't get it built the way we want it. So we kind of have to go back.
Or, be really blunt. Your material fabricators are better at what they do than you are. So the material that we finally selected for the ceiling, they can make boots, they can make hats, they can make blankets, they can slice it, they can dice it, they can do 1,000 things with this stuff. And here we are with our software playing around, tessellating, making patterns. And, they're on the phone sort of like, well, we do all that stuff. We have the operation. If you want to come up to Schenectady and visit us, we'll run through it with you. But for you to do this and give it to us, you're wasting your time. What you need to do is come see what we're capable of doing, and then we'll work within the parameters that you set for us. So that chicken and the egg, we start out with a goal and quickly realize in projects that we're trying to build that at some point you give way to the expertise and you let those other people engage you. You hand over what you've worked up to a certain point and then let them help you take it further. And it is completely a collaborative process. So every project here is not, we're not the sole authors. Clearly there's a number of people behind what we end up with as a result.
Shawn, that leads into my question. Basically, your acoustical design and treatment of materials and in the restaurants, every architect always comes across that situation where you've got to deal with sound and sound reverberation and so on. So I'm involved with a couple of projects of that right now. And what did you discover, and what can you impart to this group in terms of materials or shape or systems that are practical, that are worth looking at, that are enjoyable to look at, and still can be built within a reasonable amount of money that the client might have?
Well, one thing that our acoustical engineer said very first at the very beginning is that we can't account for every situation, because this was an existing warehouse, there was existing condition, and so a lot of it had to be left open-ended and then actually solved during the process. So, where the speakers were going to be placed within the actual the walls, he actually, I think, spent 6 hours the other day, maneuvering the speakers, and then it had to be moved slightly. So there's this ongoing process that is part of acoustics, which is, again, it's that performance aspect that you can't really account for everything. I mean, we take it up to a certain point, but then also allow some of the condition to be reworked and solved on an ongoing basis as well. And back to sort of the practicality of the material and so forth, we actually looked at a lot of alternative materials. And then again, it was like, you know, do you think this material would work? What do you think about this? And so we actually just didn't only look at acoustically approved materials, which are packaged, used especially for sound itself. So, you know, to cut costs down, we used a lot of other materials that did the same factors. Well, the roof tiles is actually recycled felt. And what Shawn was talking about, we actually located a supplier who do the felt liners and boots, and at the same way had the same quality as better quality than some of the acoustic panels. And it is a fraction of the price than the actual pre-manufactured acoustical goods that you find out there, and they're very expensive. You get the egg crate foam, but the shapes to capture the sound, we actually start to look at this, you know, what was our structure, can we actually achieve? So that's why we actually looked at existing models and also applied it to like other materials, other ways of building it.
I think one of the other things that, you know, may be able to, you know, assist the students in regards to sound control or sound management is just this idea of sound dampening, which is, you know, a method of either layering surfaces. And the first two projects were titled Single Surface, another Surface Study, and the cracks or the grooves or the openings in between the pallet wood to yet another layer. Like, it's amazing the difference, even in this room, that the perforations have by allowing reverberation and sound to escape to another layer. And what that other layer is extremely important. So all of a sudden, we like to think of our projects as organisms, right? They're sort of living and breathing things, and so how they perform. So we find out even in the DeGraw art space that moisture and humidity has a huge effect on sound, right? In addition to how the materials you've selected will perform. And so it's sort of like making a sandwich, right? There's a series of layers, and clearly, as you draw the diagram, the intensity of the decibels will either reflect off of that or slip through and disperse in a gradual manner. And we think it's really quite interesting, because all of a sudden, if that's a requirement, the idea of a single surface, a hard single surface, whoops, would not necessarily be so great. Right? You'd sort of be handicapping yourself if you stuck to that model. But by being informed, you can change up the reasoning and the goals to match a slightly higher criteria and hopefully succeed.